All right, let's go ahead and get going here. Matt, thanks so much for joining us, and I have some other folks that are going to swing by as well. The so and Matt, I'm obviously very really looking forward to getting your perspective and story and all this. I'll tell you that for me personally, my eyes were kind of opened on this in reading The Friendly Orange Glow by Brian Deere, which a book we talked about before that I really enjoyed. And I don't know if Matt, if you've read the Friendly Orange Glow, very well written, super interesting history. And in particular, he tells this story of Brodie Lockard, who was or is still living, but was a gymnast at Stanford and had this really debilitating accident that left him a quadriplegic. And he discovered he'd been doing work with Plato, but he got this Plato terminal that was brought into basically his hospital room, and he wrote Mahjong for the Plato, and it was this kind of exquisitely designed Mahjong, all of which using a typing stick that he was manipulating with his mouth. And he later was part of a program called Homework from Controlled Data that was deliberately designed to give Plato terminals to the disabled, which I thought is also super interesting. It left me with a lot of questions that Brian Deere doesn't necessarily answer. And then just the last bit I'll say on this that was really interesting to me is that he got got something called the Personics Headmaster, which allowed him to type much more quickly by moving it with head movements as opposed to the mouth stick. And he was able to leave the mouth stick behind. And just reading about the truly life-changing difference the technology had for Brodie, and of course, your eyes get open about how meaningful, deeply meaningful this is for those folks who are really able to do something just qualitatively and quantitatively different because the technology has been made accessible to them. And then the footnote was the Personics Headmaster was not going to be manufactured anymore. And you're just like, oh my God, this key technology.
Oh man.
So anyway, so Matt, that's kind of that's where I got, interested in this, and also just realized how ignorant I am of this aspect of history. So I'm really excited to have you here. And maybe with that intro, you can give us your perspective and your story on accessibility in computing.
So thank you. So I'm going to be at least primarily talking about blindness and low vision because that is the area that I'm familiar with. Just a little bit of personal background. I've been legally blind from birth. I have enough sight that I can read the computer screen up close, like way up close if the fonts are a little bit larger than usual, and my limited sight also helps me move around, know where I'm going. But I do use a white cane when I'm outside of my home and I can't drive, and I often use a screen reader, which, as I'll explain in more depth, is a program that basically reads aloud what's on the screen. So I'm told that I don't look this old, but I am about 40 years old. I was born in 1980, and so talking computers were an integral part of my childhood. And I've read a little bit about the very early history of talking computers. I know, for instance, that there was a talking computer terminal called Total Talk in 1981. But the first talking computer that I was exposed to as a child was an Apple IIe running a speech synthesis card called the Echo. And if you'll indulge me, I would like to play a brief audio clip of the Echo. Hopefully the low-tech solution of pointing my phone mic at my desk speakers will work well enough. Can I do this? This will be about 30 seconds.
Absolutely, definitely. Yeah.
Hello, I am unable to speak synthesizer. I can take normal text and turn it into speech. Or you may program me using phonemes, word counts. I can talk low. I can talk fast. Rather make me not read numbers. Or slow. Rather make me not read numbers. I can say letters. Make me CBDFG. And can also pronounce punctuation. period, comma, question mark, semicolon, dollar sign. Now type in what you want me to say or type in to end this demo.
So did that come through well enough?
Wow, yes.
Now, that was not the pinnacle of speech synthesis technology, even when it came out in 1982, but it was relatively low cost. The hardware, the card that you could put in an Apple II was basically a sound output card using some kind of low bitrate LPC, linear predictive coding. The speech synthesis software was simple enough, primitive enough to fit in the 16K memory expansion card of an Apple II Plus,
Wow.
where it would be out of the way of any basic programs that you might want to run. And it was, for the most part, only basic programs that could work with the primitive screen reader that came with that synthesizer. The screen reader was called Text Talker, and it would redirect the I/O routines so that the output would go through the speech synthesizer, and in fact, the speech synthesis would block the output. So if a program was outputting multiple lines, then visually you would see one line at a time being displayed on the screen as they were spoken.
Wow.
And
so, can I ask some questions about this, Matt? Sorry.
Sure.
So you said this is 1982.
That was when that card came out.
Okay,
yes.
Because I just.
But I was first exposed to it as like a 6-year-old in 1986 or 7.
Well, so it also the first time I feel I heard speech synthesis, quote unquote speech synthesis, was of course watching War Games, 1983.
War Games. I'm told that was fake.
It is fake. It is fake, and it makes me feel so much better. I was blown away by the speech synthesis. I don't know if you know the story on that. It is fake. To make it sound convincingly fake, do you know what they did? I mean, this is just like genius at some level. They read the sentences backwards, and then they rechopped it up.
Oh, wow.
So it's just a person reading it. And I remember at the time being like, wow, that's like really but now hearing the synthesis.
They could have just used an echo, though.
Well, but
why didn't they just use an echo?
Because honestly, the quote unquote technology they had was further along than the actual technology. Because
now I do happen to have an example on hand of what was probably the pinnacle of speech synthesis technology in 1982. If this is like a 15-second clip.
Absolutely. Go for it.
So, and what you're going to hear before the actual speech synthesizer is a man named Dennis Klatt, who was the inventor of Deck Talk. And he, in 1986, compiled a bunch of recordings of various snapshots in the history of speech synthesis technology. And he introduces each one. So you'll hear him, and then you'll hear this Pros 2000 system.
32. The Speech Plus Incorporated Pros 2000 Commercial System, 1982.
4 hours of steady work faced us. A large-sized instructions is hard to sell. The boy was there when the sun rose. A rod is used to catch king salmon.
So,
wow.
Quite a bit more advanced, but also, I have no doubt, quite a bit more expensive. You probably not many public school systems could afford one of those.
And is this being designed with accessibility in mind at this time?
I mean, I don't know if the Pros 2000 was the Echo. From what I understand, the original manufacturer, Street Electronics, had accessibility in mind as one of the possible applications. Their Text Talker screen reader was certainly designed with that in mind. The maintenance of Text Talker later in the 80s got taken over by the American Printing House for the Blind.
And then, Matt, just ask you another question because I didn't want to gloss over it. So you discovered this as a 6-year-old, you said in the late 80s, like 1986. You said, I think.
Yep.
So was that the first speech synthesis that you had heard? And
yes, it was.
And so take me to that moment. Was that? I mean, that must have been an amazing, memorable moment for you, I imagine.
So I have a couple of early memories from that time. So I was in first grade, and I all throughout my elementary school years and through part of middle school, I was always I always attended whichever school in town had the program for the blind and visually impaired kids, the special ed program. And so I would spend a good deal of time each week in the room with in the classroom with the special ed teachers that worked with us. And I think my earliest memory of hearing speech synthesis was one of the teachers in that room was working with me on my handwriting, because remember, I do have some vision. I can handwrite with some difficulty because my head has to be up against the paper to see what I'm writing. But while I was working on my handwriting, one of the other blind students would be working on a talking computer on the other side of the room. And I think I envied them. But my turn came soon enough because at some point in my first grade year, they started teaching me how to touch type. And there was a program for the Apple II called Talking Text Writer, which was a talking word processor using this Echo speech synthesizer. You couldn't use any of the mainstream word processors because the screen reader was too primitive. It wouldn't work with anything that wrote directly to screen memory. But there was a talking word processor, and I remember that the Echo seemed to struggle with the hard G sound. You might have noticed that in the clip. And it also didn't pronounce my first name, Matthew, correctly.
Really?
It was like Matthew.
Interesting.
And I asked my teacher why it couldn't say things correctly, and she tried to explain, but I was a 6 or 7 year old, and the teacher wasn't particularly computer savvy. So, I mean, the explanation couldn't be very satisfactory. But yes,
and the 6502 and how much RAM? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And Text Talker having to fit in the upper 16K of memory. So that was, and I had access to, and the computers that were adapted for us in the public schools were Apple IIs with Echo speech synthesizers until 1994, when I was in 7th grade.
Wow.
And
Wow.
at that point, they brought in a PC running MS-DOS, and there were two access technology. We have an abbreviation in our industry called AT, which variously stands for access technology, adaptive technology, assistive technology, take your pick. But there were 2 AT programs on this PC. There was first of all, there was a built-in speech synthesis card called the Keynote Gold. And there was a screen reader called Master Touch, so-called because it had a hardware peripheral that came with it. It was like a touch-sensitive tablet that you could run your finger along to review the screen. I don't know that part ever really caught on, and there was also a screen magnification program called Zoomtext, which would basically it would you would have it would display a portion of the screen magnified, and you could pan around, and it would automatically track your cursor and things like that. And so since I had some usable vision, they taught me how to use both the screen reader and the screen magnifier.
And that must have been a hell of an upgrade from,
Yes, it definitely was. The MS-DOS screen readers, first of all, the PC had more room, although you were still dealing with the cursed 640K memory limitation. But all of the fun of multiple TSRs coexisting in that. But at least the MS-DOS screen reader was able to read from screen memory, because the PC, as I recall, was a much more interrupt-driven platform than the Apple II. So that there were more ways that a DOS screen reader could kind of stick its hooks in and provide access, even if the application wasn't fully cooperative.
It is truly the glass half full of DOS, is the fact that an accessibility application can get its hooks in, because of course there's plenty of.
Also the glass half full of Windows.
Oh, interesting.
As I'll get to.
Yeah, interesting.
Now I have an audio sample of the Keynote Gold synthesizer. This again was probably not the pinnacle of speech technology for its time, but it was a definite upgrade from the Echo.
Space, rest, stop button, Alt plus S. C, virtual recorder dialog, button, Alt plus S. Folder view list, Audacity 2M31.
Okay, that's enough of that. That was just some guy making a recording of Keynote Gold with a modern Windows screen reader. He must have had some old hardware lying around, but that was just one that I happened to find on the net.
That is an
yeah, so
the thing that sounds like the Cylon in the original 1970s Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah. Now, with the Keynote Gold, I'm pretty sure that the speech synthesis was being done by some kind of processor on the card, because when we turned on our DOS PC, immediately before the BIOS could have even finished doing its power on self-test, you would hear Keynote Gold.
That's awesome.
And Matt, at that time, was hardware required? I ask because my earliest memory of these kinds of technologies was Talking Moose, I think in like the late 80s on the Mac, which all this was very evocative of.
So the Mac could certainly do software synthesis. I remember, so I first got online in 93 using the 2400 baud modem in my mother's computer. And I remember reading in 94 about a DOS screen reader that could use the software synthesizer that came with the Sound Blaster 16 card. But what I particularly remember reading about it was that this software synthesis option didn't work with some terminal programs because of the way that the software synthesis would tie up the CPU. So
I mean, really, you think about, like, technically, I'm just so impressed with the Echo, but just as Matt, as you're talking, like, you really have to get your hooks into a lot of the system in order to be able to kind of pull this off. This is really challenging to pull off.
Oh, and I haven't even got into GUI screen reading yet.
Right, yeah.
So let's get into that now. So the first screen reader for a GUI was a program called Outspoken for the Mac, which was released in 1989. If there are any pre-OS 10 Mac fans in here, you may remember a screensaver called After Dark from a company called Berkeley Systems. That company, apparently their real bread and butter, at least at first, was developing these accessibility tools. Apparently, from what I read in Wikipedia, that it was initially under contract to the National Institutes of Health. But anyway, Outspoken came out in 1989. The first Windows screen reader called Window Bridge came out in 1992. And I'm sure you guys are dying to know how these things could have possibly did what they did. So basically, what Outspoken relied on exclusively, as far as I'm aware, was basically hooking into intercepting calls to like the quick draw graphics routines. So it could build up a model of what was being drawn onto the screen. And the term that was coined for this, that basically everybody adopted, was an off-screen model, OSM. So if you had an application that did its own text rendering, rather than using Quick Draw, or in the case of Windows, the graphics device interface, GDI, if you had an application that did its own text rendering, then it would not be accessible with one of these screen readers.
And circa the early 90s, how many applications were using the Windows facility to render text versus doing their own thing?
I think most of them.
Okay,
at this point.
So it would work with most. And I mean, in terms of the off-screen model, how would it represent those things that are strictly visual? Or is it really focused on reading text, or is it trying to?
A screen reader could. So by intercepting these routines, the calls to these routines, a screen reader could, at least some of the time, detect if an icon was being drawn to the screen, and then it could do, by doing like a checksum or a hash or similar of the contents of the icon, it could give that icon an identity, and then it could say something like graphic 53 or something. And then if a sighted person was working with you to adapt the system to help you configure the system, then they could label the graphics and store those labels in a database.
And did you yourself, you used all this technology as well, the early Windows technology, or?
I did not.
Okay.
And so, again, being online in '94, I kind of, and following, I followed one or two forums about this technology, and I kind of remember reading about about the existence of Windows screen readers, but it wasn't something I pursued at the time because I never had. Well, first of all, since I have some usable vision, I was primarily using the computer I was completely using the computer that way when I was at home because I never had access to these hardware speech synthesizers at home. So I didn't get exposure to any of these early GUI screen readers, and in fact, I didn't really start to learn about what was going on in that area until 1998, when I was about 17. And so by that time, I had been out of the public school system for a few years. In my 8th grade year, my parents moved me to the same private religious school that my siblings were attending, and I was okay with it at the time. But that I did become the first and only visually impaired student at that school.
Oh boy, that can't be easy.
And I mean, it had its ups and downs. I'm a little embarrassed to admit it now, but the school. The principal of the school kind of decided to make me the school's charity case. He did an all school fundraiser to buy me a laptop and screen magnification software.
Well, you're not going to turn that down.
But,
I mean, I guess that could be. That's like, oh, you want to give me a laptop, maybe? Okay.
Yeah. And So, but in 1998, I through pure coincidence, I happened to cross paths with a blind person online for the first time in years, and so as I got to know her, and don't read anything into the gender, we were just friends. But as I got to know her,
yeah,
go ahead.
Yes, I didn't mean to interrupt. But so where did you? Because you mentioned this too, that you were like hanging out in forums. Where did you meet in 1998? Is this Usenet? Are there particular websites, or how did you?
I was totally going to ask, is this Usenet?
That's right.
Actually, this was on a type of mud.
Nice. There you go.
Yeah. So I was my preferred distraction from the homework that I really should have been doing was hanging out on, in particular, a flavor of mud called a Moo, for mud object oriented. And it had its own programming language, and for me, the appeal was it was a combination of chat room and fun programming environment. So so I happened to cross paths with a blind person on one of these moves, and as I got to know her and learned about how she was using her, learned that she was using a Windows screen reader. Now, unfortunately for her, she had gotten saddled with, and I should mention that at this time, Windows screen readers cost, just never mind the speech synthesizer. The software would cost like $500 or more. Because, at least the rationalization for this was that it was a small market, and heavy demands on tech support, etc. So she had unfortunately gotten stuck with a Windows screen reader that wasn't keeping up with the fast changing world of Windows at that time. And this was also a particularly dark time for access to the web on Windows, because as I'm sure you recall, tables and frames were both being heavily used, and these screen readers were still depending heavily on their off-screen models to provide access to the contents of the web browser window. So if you had a web page that used the typical layout table with navigation links on the left and page content on the right, and you tried to read that with your screen reader, it would just read straight across.
Right. Yeah.
Now, there was a web browser designed specifically for blind people called PW WebSpeak, but that was that was its own web browser, not Netscape or Internet Explorer, and it was I'm sure that there were a great many websites that weren't compatible with this specialized web browser.
I feel like there's so many follow-up questions just on PW WebSpeak. One, I don't want to tell them how to do their branding, but it's not exactly a catchy. I mean, was one discover PW WebSpeak? And is this aimed again, or this is aimed at accessibility explicitly?
Yes,
okay,
squarely.
Squarely. Yeah, interesting. Sorry. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, and then the screen reader that Anne, the blind person that I had met online, had gotten that. I don't know if she bought it herself or if it was bought for her. It was developed by one person who apparently was not making enough money from it, and he had to go take a job at another company. So it was basically abandoned. And so by late 1998, Anne and I were seriously thinking about getting her set up with Linux and Emacs Speak, which is where and as I meant, when Dan brought up Emacs Speak last week, I mentioned that I had made some small contributions to that community, and so that was what started me down that road.
So you're 18. Have you decided that? I mean, clearly, you're software engineer. You have programmed what you programmed. I mean, had you decided that was your life's calling at this point?
I knew for a long time at this point that programming was my life's calling. I mean, I had started learning to program on my family's Apple II GS computer when I was 8 years old, and I had an uncle who taught me basically everything he knew about mainly basic programming on that platform.
Okay, I've got to ask on the 2GS. I mean, total shout out to the 2GS. I spent way too much time playing epic summer games on the 2GS. But the GS, of course, stands for graphics and sound. Was there better speech synthesis on the 2GS?
Yes. Unfortunately, I do not have an audio clip of the one text-to-speech engine that I know of.
Well,
for that.
I don't know, Matt. It's pretty disappointing that you don't have an audio clip from an Apple II GS.
But
it was better.
The thing is, though, as far as I know, nobody ever did anything that could be considered a screen reader using the speech synthesis software that was available for that machine.
Yeah, interesting.
I know what I had a brief email correspondence in '94 with a blind programmer who was working on a GUI screen reader for the 2GS, but he was doing it using the Echo synthesizer, I think, because he was as some kind of hack on top of the version of Text Talker that was available for the 2GS. Again, maybe the I don't know.
Well, you get this problem. And it's kind of a theme you've hit on a couple of times where this is super technical to develop, and ultimately people have to eat, and you've got to have some. When these markets you begin to slice the markets smaller and smaller and smaller. I mean, this is why you're kind of leading up to this open source moment, which must have been a real watershed moment, I imagine.
Yeah. Although what Anne and I didn't understand going into our adventure with Linux and Emacs Speak was that the author of Emacs Speak, TV Raman, was basically building it for himself. And of course, that is the way with personal open source projects. But he was building it for himself, not as something that was specifically designed to be more generally useful. And when we and also other newcomers arrived on the Emacs Speak mailing list and started asking basic questions, I think there was an expectation from Raman and the other regulars on the list that users of Emacs Speak would already be fluent in Emacs and comfortable with reading things, finding things in the documentation or even the mailing list archives. but I did I did what I could to help Anne come up to speed, and then I tried to contribute back to the community in general. As I mentioned last week, I made an RPM package of Emacs Speak for Red Hat. Now I went back looking through this period in the Emacs Speak mailing list archives the other day, and one of the things that struck me was fairly early in her time coming up to speed with Emacs Speak, Anne posted a message about how she was using the W3 web browser for Emacs, and now she was surfing the net more than she ever had before, because it was such a better experience to read the web page. Although W3 had its own problems, and in fact, one of the small Emacs Lisp hacks that I developed that I had forgotten about in the intervening years was an extension to W3 to convert the tables on a web page into something that you could move through linearly with your up and down arrow keys, as opposed to actually navigating it as a table, because again, layout tables were so common in this time. So in a way, we had one of the same problems as the Windows screen readers, but now we could hack around it.
Right, and also it's not $500. You've got the kind of the liberation, and you know it's not going to be end of life. I mean, you've got certain things that you get from open source that you're not going to get from a proprietary solution.
Yeah. Although things were getting better on the Windows side, it took a while for me to realize it, because late in 1999, and if anyone here has heard anything about Windows screen readers in the past couple of decades, you've probably heard of a screen reader called JAWS, which stands for Job Access with Speech. And JAWS came out, I think it came out for Windows 3.1 in 1995, and for Windows 95 like a year or two later. But in 1999, in the fall of that year, according to a friend of mine who was the engineering manager for JAWS at the time, they released an update which introduced what they called the virtual buffer. And it's not a very good name, but I'll explain what it did. So when you were browsing a web page with Internet Explorer, they only ever did it for IE, not for Netscape. But when you were browsing a web page with Internet Explorer, JAWS would start intercepting your keystrokes for the common cursor. Well, okay, let me back up. First, at least according to my friend Chris, the engineering manager at the time, JAWS would grab the HTML for the page from IE using the object model that IE was exposing through something called COM, or Component Object Model. It was basically the technology that was used by things like Visual Basic for applications and VBScript.
COM and OLE, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So JAWS would grab the HTML out of IE using this COM object model, and according to Chris, it would parse the HTML and build up its own representation of the contents of the web page. Later, when IE actually exposed the whole DOM through COM, JAWS could traverse that, and then it would intercept common cursor movement keys like up and down arrow, home, end, control end, etc., and it basically give you a linear document type of structure that you could move through. And then when it really started getting good was when they added what they called quick navigation keys. For instance, H to move to the next heading, or Shift H to move to the previous heading. They all had this pattern. F to move to the next form field, B to move to the next button, and so on and so on. So you could more easily jump around the page when you wanted to, or read it linearly if you wanted to do that.
So Matt, two questions. One, job access with speech? I've not heard of JAWS. What is the job in job? Is it like job, like a computing job? Where does the name come from?
The name is intended to signify that it's for access to employment.
That's okay. So like job, like getting a job.
Yeah.
And so was the genesis of this like a program to help folks get work? I mean, I got more questions now.
Well, I mean, it was a commercial product developed by a company called at the time called Hinter Joyce. The head of the company was a blind programmer named Ted Hinter, and I mean, probably it was what you might call a retronym or a backronym.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, I was wondering that too. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
But
And then my other question is, well, although you answered it, this was really designed with accessibility in mind, because some of
absolutely,
the keystrokes you're mentioning, I'd like that would be just kind of generally useful to be able to whip through a web page just using the keyboard, and not have to go to a mouse. Was there any? Do folks use this for reasons other than accessibility?
not as far as I'm aware.
Interesting.
Although they might, I mean, it might be more attractive for people to do that now that functionality is built into the narrator screen reader, which is part of Windows.
That was probably is that the next chapter here? Is that the way? And where do you come into the picture from Mike? Because you worked at Microsoft, so
I worked at, well, I did for 3 years, but I didn't join Microsoft until 2017.
Oh,
that
wow,
was
okay, yeah.
that was fairly late in the story.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, so I was doing my thing with Emacs Speak and Linux, and there was another screen reader for Linux that came on the scene around 1999 called SpeakUp. And this, believe it or not, was implemented as a patch for the Linux kernel. Now it was at the time entirely dependent on these hardware-based speech synthesizers, which were still pretty widely used in the late 90s. Although software-based solutions were beginning to take off on Windows, but even then there was a problem, which was that unless you had a fairly high-end sound card like the Sound Blaster Live that had its own built-in mixing of multiple audio streams, you couldn't have speech synthesis and any other sound playing at the same time until, if I'm not mistaken, Windows 2000 in the NT lineage or Windows Millennium in the 9X lineage, when Microsoft added software mixing to the OS. So
can I ask a naive question?
Sure.
The challenge of speech synthesis, how much of that is specialized hardware versus just having enough compute to actually work?
It was really just having enough compute.
Interesting. Okay.
And I get, specialized hardware in that the very early computers didn't have their built-in sound output wasn't up to the task. Like the Apple II, you had basically 1-bit resolution in its built-in speaker. The PC's built-in speaker, it could do its own tone generation, or again, 1-bit resolution from clicking the speaker on and off. So lack of sound hardware built into the computer was a factor, but and lack of built-in support for mixing multiple sounds in the OS became the limiting factor for Windows in the late 90s. But meanwhile, over on the Linux side, I mentioned SpeakUp, and SpeakUp was written by a blind programmer and system administrator. He was working as a sysadmin at a university, and he wanted something that would speak as far as possible everything that happened on a Linux box from boot up to shutdown. And so he wrote SpeakUp as a patch for the console driver in the kernel. If I'm not mistaken, he even went so far as to do his own serial port I/O routines so that his speech synthesis support could be up and running even before the normal serial driver was. And
that is awesome. I mean, that's a great way to do it. Honestly, I mean, it is the single source of a certain kind of ground truth in the kernel, so it makes sense.
Yeah, and as one person put it to me around that time, try reading a kernel panic with Emacs Speak.
Right. Oh, in terms of like their motivation for this was, hey, we can't participate in kernel development because when this thing panics, we can't.
Or independently get your box out of certain situations.
Interesting. Forget even the kernel development side of this. Just like my box is in a reboot loop, and I literally have got no way of figuring out why because I don't.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting.
Right. So I started, and by this time in 1999, I had my double talk speech synthesizer. It was a box that connected to the serial port of my machine, and so I started playing with Speak Up, and I realized that in some ways, as I said, in some ways it was a more complete solution than Emacs Speak, and my first real contribution to trying to make it easier for people to get started with Linux and Speak Up was, so I don't know if any of you guys remember, but Linux had a file system called UMS-DOS, which was basically a Unix friendly a file system with all of the necessary features for Unix, like long file names and permissions and ownership, etc., implemented on top of the MS-DOS file system. So that meant that if you had a zip archive of one of these UMS-DOS file systems, you could unzip it onto your hard drive and then run it without having to mess with repartitioning and things like that. Because there was also a DOS utility called loadlin that could boot into Linux.
So it's like a DOS file system is like a store? I mean, am I understanding that?
Yeah. Basically, a DOS file system is a backing store for a Linux file system. So the Slackware Linux distribution had a package called ZipSlack, which was basically a Slackware-based system in a zip file that you could just unzip onto your DOS formatted hard drive and run. And so I took ZipSlack and Speak Up and created ZipSpeak. Maybe not the best name, but it did fit the 8-character limitation.
There you go. Right. Okay. So ZipSpeak is. I mean, honestly, like, where is ZipSpeak running? Is ZipSpeak running? Are we in DOS or in Linux here? I'm honestly confused.
Well, I mean, the idea was that you would boot your Windows machine into DOS mode, run this loadlin utility, and then it would boot you up into Linux from DOS.
Loadlin was basically a DOS com file that acted as a MS-DOS,
as a bootloader for Linux.
Yeah.
Yep. And so and Speak Up at the time, you had to compile a kernel for the specific speech synthesizer that you were using, and Speak Up at this time had 5 different 5 speech synthesis drivers. So I remember writing this elaborate build script that, elaborate for me at the time.
It's not elaborate by any standards, honestly. It seems like we got a lot of moving parts here. So, all right, so ZipSpeak is then allowing for Speak Up to be much more broadly used, to be used by folks who are coming from the Windows and DOS side. Is that a fair statement?
Yep. Yeah. And so I put it out in, I think, March of 2000. It got /dotted.
There we go. /dot. Nice. Hopefully /dot had nice things to say. The Hacker News of its day could say some very not nice things.
Well, there was one guy, I think he might have been a troll, who was commenting about, why are you being so selective about which speech synthesizers you support?
Internet, never change. Some things I just feel like truisms. It feels like you can.
Yeah.
An arbitrary good innovation. Interesting. Okay. So
go ahead.
No, sir, go ahead.
My other major contribution to Speak Up in early 2001 was I refactored the synthesizer driver code so that you could compile all the synth drivers into one kernel and specify the one that you wanted on the command line.
And then, are you connected to folks? I mean, you've met fellow blind folks online. Are you connected to folks for whom this is opening up kind of new doors? Because I mean, obviously, you've got a very personal motivation for this stuff.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of my spare time around that time, kind of doing one-on-one helping people get set up with either Emacs Speak or Speak Up.
That must have been that's obviously got to be very personally rewarding, because I mean you're allowing someone to do something presumably they couldn't previously do at some level.
Yeah, and like I said, but by the time I was doing some of this, things had already gotten better on the Windows side, but only if you could afford JAWS.
Got it. Right. So now you're actually allowing people to do this with open source. Yeah, neat.
Yeah. So
I'm also curious just what using Linux looks like if you're visually impaired. Like, I assume you're not trying to start X or do things like that. And things
that
like
came later.
Vim, things like Vim are probably a nightmare. You've got Emacs speak. Like, does Ed become a reasonable choice of editor?
There was one well-known guy in the blind Linux community who seriously advocated that blind Linux users should use Ed. Because he seriously felt that a line-oriented program like Ed, that mastering a line-oriented program like Ed was the best option. And in fact, he went on to write a program that he called Ed Browse, which was a reimplementation of Ed plus a browser using that same interface style.
Oh my
Wow.
God, that's awesome. And then like things like curses and tables and some of the more visually
I think
stuff.
I think my wake up call that this was using interfaces like that was perhaps not with a screen reader was perhaps not the best solution came when and this leads into the next phase in my story, which is the beginning of 2001, when I had been subscribed to the Speak Up mailing list for quite a while at this time, and a guy posted to the list asking for help getting a Red Hat Linux machine talking, and I was the one that that replied to him and offered to help, and as I'm sure some of you recall, the text mode Red Hat installer used the whole pseudo GUI style, not technically using curses, but it amounted to the same thing with dialogues and the focused button would be highlighted and things like that. And I just remember trying to walk him through, struggling to make sense of what was what was going on with that program. And I think that was when I began to reconsider whether accessing using Windows with a good screen reader might be better. So
yeah. So what is it doing? It's just going dash 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 plus dash dash dash.
Well, fortunately, the screen readers are a little bit smarter than that. But the problem is that and especially with the pseudo GUI toolkit that this Red Hat installer was using, the cursor, the blinking cursor, which might not even be visible, but was really the only indication that a screen reader had of where you were on the screen, it might not always be in a useful place. And when if you were arrowing through a menu and the highlight was moving to indicate where you were, that honestly I don't remember all of the details at this point, but I do remember that it was a challenge to work with. But I mean, in a way, it was good that you at least had access to it in some form. There are still plenty of GUIs, actual GUIs even now, that are completely inaccessible. This, at least being text, you had something, but it wasn't. And this guy, Mike, who later became my boss, he was proficient with Windows. And he was, and the other thing that kind of clued me into the fact that things had changed while I was off in Linux land, he was exclusively using a software speech synthesizer on his Windows PC, not one of the hardware options. So,
so things had shifted to the point where new things were going to be possible now without specialized hardware.
Yeah, and he had JAWS, which meant that he had the best Windows screen reader that was available. And so for him, trying to work with Linux and Speak Up was a downgrade.
Interesting. So did you go to Windows at that point, or what did you end up doing?
So it was it was a while longer before I left Linux behind for a while. But as I mentioned, Mike became my boss, and this kind of transitions into where I started working on accessibility for pay, because Mike was working at the time with an offshore programming company in Russia to try to develop a new product that he called Freedom Box, which was a talking. It was basically so he described it at the time as attempting to be an AOL for the blind, a very easy to use way of accessing the internet, designed specifically for blind people. And what he was trying to do at the time was using not only speech synthesis but speech recognition, so you could give the thing voice commands, and it would talk back to you. And so I initially started working for him as his system administrator because the product had an online service that went with it. And the first version of the product, which, like I said, was a fully custom interface based on speech synthesis and recognition. It got some positive responses, but it was not taken seriously by the basically the establishment, the people that were training blind people to use computers, particularly and this was never intended for access in an employment environment. It was intended for like elderly blind people trying to use the internet at home. But still, in order to reach any of this market, we needed something that would be taken seriously by the existing, by the people that were that would make decisions on what to purchase.
Yeah, interesting.
Whatever.
Yeah, right.
So what we ended up doing for version 2 in 2003 to 2004 was we did, instead of a fully custom, very simplistic interface, we did a talking browser based on Mozilla that it kind of more resembled JAWS in the way that it worked.
And that is a pretty, I'm trying to remember. So, because that is right when Firebird gets renamed, right? I mean, this is like...
Yep. And in fact, one of the decisions that I had to make at that time was whether to use the existing SeaMonkey code base or the new Firebird fork. And I went with the old SeaMonkey code base, which was, in retrospect, a mistake. But yeah, I did. So I basically did something akin to the JAWS virtual buffer, but implemented in JavaScript. And it was this talking browser could run on both Windows and Linux. But to make it run on Linux, I had to address the problem of mixing multiple sound streams, which at that point, amazingly, had not yet been had not really been addressed, at least not to my satisfaction, on the Linux side.
It does feel like we're on a collision course here with Pulse Audio.
Yeah, well, Pulse Audio came out like a year or so after my implementation, I think.
Interesting.
At the time, you had two implementations. The GNOME camp had eSound, and the KDE camp had something called ARTS, and ARTS for, I think the RT was for real time. But what I recall about eSound in particular was that it used a very naive sample rate conversion algorithm, which meant that when you had a speech synthesizer that was putting out audio at 11 kilohertz and you were trying to upsample it to 44 kilohertz, it sounded pretty nasty. And so I looked around all over the place for a sample rate converter that I could use. And I ended up finding one that met my requirements in a mod player, of all places. And I pulled out that code and I used it.
And then how much of this is, I mean, the sound focus and I guess the KDE versus GNOME sound wars. I mean, I can't imagine that these two camps got along and had a consensus on I mean, I was not.
Well, and I put my implementation out as open source, but nobody else ever used it.
How much of their focus was on accessibility versus other aspects of sound? I mean,
so GNOME, I mean, KDE to this day doesn't have a screen reader, as far as I know. But on the GNOME side, but on the GNOME side, Sun Microsystems, they put together a team to implement accessibility for GNOME, and as part of that, they actually ended up developing not one but two screen readers. One, the first of which ended up getting killed off.
That's very on brand for Sun.
That sounds like Sun.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I believe
that. Originally they had contracted with a company called Baum, BAUM, which was mainly known for manufacturing Braille devices. But Baum had a team in Romania which was working on a screen reader, which Sun contracted. Sun somehow engaged with Baum to develop a screen reader for GNOME called, and this is a mouthful, Gnopernicus. I kid you not, it was called Gnopernicus. And I'm not well versed in the problems with that program, but it was bad enough that my friend at the time, Mark Mulcahy, who was working for Sun, and his official and he worked on the GNOME accessibility team, but he wasn't tasked with working on the screen reader. He was tasked with working on basically their abstraction layer over the various speech synthesizers, a component called GNOME Speech, and it supported both hardware and software speech synthesizers. But Mark, who is blind himself, got so fed up with Gnopernicus that he took matters into his own hands and wrote a screen reader called Orca. And where that name came from is that so you already know that the leading screen reader for Windows was JAWS. Before that, there had been a screen reader for DOS called Flipper.
And of course, you got to go to a higher trophic level. That is, I'd say, that is very on brand for Sun.
Well, apparently, Mark someone had suggested that progression to Mark when he was previously an intern at Microsoft. So Mark wrote Orca and retro, after the fact, got permission from Sun to put it out. And Orca is to this day the GNOME screen reader, but Mark hasn't worked on it for a very long time now.
And this works how? By tapping into GTK or?
To explain this part, I need to back up a bit and explain another thing that started happening on Windows in the late 90s. So, like I mentioned, very early on, the GUI screen readers intercepted calls to functions in QuickDraw or GDI or whatever to build an off-screen model. But it didn't take long for people to realize that wasn't going to be good enough. And in 1997, Microsoft put out something that they called Microsoft Active Accessibility, of course, because everything at that time was active this, active that from Microsoft. So Microsoft Active Accessibility, or MSAA, which I understand also stands for something else in some kind of anti-aliasing thing. But MSAA was an API that an application or GUI toolkit could implement to programmatically expose the content and semantics of the UI. And like the Internet Explorer object model, MSAA was based on COM. But one of the first things that the GNOME accessibility team at Sun did was to define an accessibility API for GNOME. And my understanding is they did this in two layers. At the GTK level, GTK2 and GTK3 depended on something called ATK, which was basically the accessibility API for GTK. So that was at the the in process C library level, and then for the actual inter-process communication between the application and the access technology screen reader or whatever, they did what they called ATSPI, Assistive Technology Service Provider Interface. Thank you, Sun, for that mouthful.
Sorry.
Which was based on in the GNOME 2 era, it was based on Corba, and then for GNOME 3, they redid it based on DBus. So
out of the frying pan into the fire. I'm not sure.
yeah. And AtSpy, I will pronounce it. I'm not deeply familiar with it, but my understanding is that it exacerbates the problem of being an inter-process communication protocol with the overhead that entails by being fairly chatty, like not being able to like bulk fetch information in one in one IPC call, but having to do a lot of back and forth. And that's basically, I mean, Orca would connect to. So first of all, each of the applications that supported this accessibility stack would register itself with an AtSpy registry daemon, and then Orca would connect to that, and then from there would get object references to each of the windows on the desktop. And it would register. Oh, and with all of these accessibility APIs, that the screen reader registers event handlers, so it can find out about things like when the currently focused control has changed, and things like that.
And then, so how much kind of programmer awareness does this stuff require? I mean, does this require that the programmer really program for accessibility, and to what degree do programs kind of comply with that, or?
Well, it depends. It depends on what level of the stack they're working with. If they're writing their own GUI toolkit, then it does require total cooperation from them. If they're writing an application based on an existing toolkit like GTK or pick your Windows toolkit or a web application, then I guess it depends on how custom they decide to go. Like if they're just doing straightforward buttons and checkboxes and edits and list boxes, then in a lot of cases with simple UI patterns like that, we can get accessibility for free.
You're right. Okay, so that answers the question. They're basically hooking into the Windows toolkits to minimize that kind of that's of course like what you want to do. Makes sense.
Yeah. Only now, if any of you have ever seen me on Hacker News, it might have been because I was posting a comment on an article about some random GUI toolkit which had zero accessibility.
Right. So another thing I was going to ask is that when you have these kind of step forward in terms of technology, it must feel like, okay, boy, now there's another community that needs to go be educated about what's required for accessibility. Or is that not the case? I mean, in particular, I'm wondering about the movement to the device and to the phone. I mean, has that been hopefully net positive for accessibility, or?
It has been, although at first when the iPhone came out, we didn't think it was going to be, because the iPhone, of course, was and is an all touchscreen device with very few buttons. And when the first iPhone was released in 2007, it didn't have a screen reader built into the OS. And of course, iOS being as locked down as it is, there wasn't a chance in hell that there would be a third-party screen reader for that platform. But then, luckily, in 2009, Apple introduced the VoiceOver screen reader along with the iPhone 3GS. And Google was quick to follow with TalkBack, although it was a couple years before TalkBack on Android was at the same level of usability as, well, anywhere near, really, the same level of usability as VoiceOver on iOS. But the iPhone was really a game changer for us because it was the first mainstream mobile device that had a screen reader built into it. And with the explosion in apps for that platform, that just opened up a whole new world for us. And then, of course, it wasn't long before there were apps being developed specifically for blind people. In some places, in some cases, replacing special purpose hardware devices because the iPhone had so many useful sensors and things built in.
Right. Yeah, I mean, 'cause you now have got such power in your pocket. You've got obviously all of the hardware support you would need to do any of this stuff, and it's been able to ride the consumer economics, presumably.
Yeah, and more recently, Apple is pioneering a new approach to screen reading, which is basically using machine learning, optical character recognition, and other forms of machine learning to look at the pixels on the screen and try to figure out from there what's going on. In iOS 14, they introduced something called screen recognition, which does a pretty decent job, at least in some cases, of taking a completely inaccessible application and making it at least kind of accessible through machine learning.
That's very impressive.
Yeah, I mean,
and sometimes when I see the what seems to be the constant uphill battle with the long tail of GUI toolkits, I wonder if things like Apple's screen recognition are really going to be the future of the screen reader on all platforms.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like, I mean, machine learning opens up some possibilities that obviously we didn't have before, where we actually don't need necessarily programmer compliance or using a particular toolkit. We can just actually look at the pixels that are rendered and actually then, that's interesting. Well, and it's a relief to hear that it. I mean, I don't want to be overly optimistic, but it does sound like things have, broadly speaking, improved with available computation and so on.
Yeah. I mean, the machine learning in particular is a really promising new direction. I haven't yet seen anybody other than Apple doing that yet. At least the team that I was on at Microsoft wasn't working on that while I was there, but I'm sure they will at point. I hope they will at some point.
Point that it sort of cross over from the main limitation being just the capabilities of the hardware to being more of the social problem of how do you convince people to do this, right? Because like presumably in the 80s it's mostly a hardware limitation, and in the early 2000s it sounds like it's just GNOME and KDE not liking each other.
Yeah, I think that that the early 2000s was when the last, like I said, on the Windows side, the last reason to use specialized hardwares for speech synthesis went in 2000 when Windows itself added the ability to mix multiple audio streams. Linux, of course, lagged behind, but that wasn't a hardware problem. By the mid 2000s, I would say just about everybody was using software on a standard PC without having to have a special speech synthesizer card or device.
Man, I guess it's been super educational. I mean, there's so many things I feel that I've learned about, and not just EdBrowse. Although I like Adam's tweet. I'm definitely going to go check out EdBrowse.
Amazing, yeah,
it is amazing. So I guess a couple of things. Just one, what are some of the open problems in accessibility, and maybe kind of in the same stroke? I mean, you were talking about kind of the Hacker News comments that you have to kind of remind people about the need for accessibility. What is that kind of, if you could distill that reminder? I mean, what should software engineers know about accessibility?
Well, first of all, if you have a choice, use an existing mature UI framework. Now, I know that there are reasons why people don't use the stock UI widgets that are provided by the OS. And kind of ironically, one place where this happens a lot, where custom GUI toolkits are common, is in digital audio workstations. And I say that's ironic because blind musician is such a stereotype. but I know. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to convince the whole world of programmers to stop trying to develop lean and mean alternatives to Electron. So I have actually started an open source project that I call Access Kit, which is an attempt to come up with a cross-platform action over the accessibility APIs that I mentioned earlier. By the way, Microsoft Active Accessibility is dead. The current Windows accessibility API is called UI Automation. I mentioned AtSpy on the free Unix side, and of course, Mac and iOS and Android also have their own accessibility APIs. And if heaven help us, you are targeting bringing your application to the web platform using something like WebGL or Canvas and porting your code to the web through WASM, then what you currently have to do over there is construct a parallel HTML DOM to expose information to the screen reader. But so I have started working on this Access Kit project to try to come up with an abstraction over all of these APIs that cross-platform GUI toolkits can use. And I'm doing it in Rust.
Nice.
We need a crab emoji. I want to. What do I file request for other emojis?
Yeah. So GitHub, Access Kit / Access Kit on GitHub. It's still pretty early in development, but I am deeply indebted to Chromium for the design because Chromium, of course, has to implement all of the platform native accessibility APIs, except probably for the iOS one because you can't run the actual Chromium engine on iOS. And I really like the abstraction that they have come up with over those APIs. But of course, that abstraction is deeply embedded in the massive Chromium C++ code base, so it's not particularly reusable. So
you're taking that abstraction or inspired by that abstraction.
Yep.
And yeah, that sounds great. Well, cool. We'll definitely, obviously, we'll link to that. And Matt, this has been great. Again, thank you so much for taking us down. I think I dare say, certainly educational for me. I think it was educational for a lot of folks. And I love the samples were terrific. And really.
Oh, since Deck Talk came up last week, I should probably play a sample of Deck Talk for those who haven't heard it.
You see, this is where I feel that Twitter Spaces needs like a lighter emoji. Like, what is the lighter equivalent? You know what I mean?
Lighter.
You should be. This is like what you do at a concert. You kind of like hold up your lighter when they're playing, Freebird or whatever.
Okay. So here's Deck Talk again with an introduction from Dennis Klatt, who, in this case, is introducing his own speech synthesizer.
35. Several of the Deck Talk voices.
I am Perfect Paul, the standard male voice.
I am Beautiful Betty, the standard female voice. Some people think I sound a bit like a man.
I am Huge Harry, a very large persistent voice. I can serve as an authority figure.
My name is Kitten Quick, and I am about 10 years old. Do I sound like a boy or a girl? I am Whispering Wendy, and it's a very breathy voice quality.
All right, that one's creepy.
So I am whispering.
And
Jesus.
that came
Whispering
out in
Wendy.
that came out in 1984.
Holy shit.
That
Which-
last one is definitely super creepy, but that's
Yeah.
really impressive.
Well, I mean, of course, he was showing off the range of vocal parameters that he could tweak.
Yeah, I mean, he can dial up a 3-pack-a-day smoker. It's amazing. I mean, that is ridiculous for the time. Holy mackerel.
Yeah, I mean, I was astonished when I learned that Deck Talk was already at that point back then.
And was Deck Talk aimed at accessibility, or is that aimed at just the more broadly speech synthesis?
I think the original Deck Talk commercial product was primarily aimed at telephony applications, and then in the early '90s, you had a couple of Deck Talk products that were aimed more at accessibility. You had the Deck Talk PC card, which was an ISA card that you could put in a PC. And then you had the Deck Talk Express box that you could hook up to your serial port. Now, there were applications of that in sort of in the disability field, but beyond just blind people, because for people who couldn't speak for whatever reason, combine something like Deck Talk with the right software that would let them choose what they wanted to say using whatever means they did have available to them. And well, Stephen Hawking, of course.
Right, of course. I was gonna say. I mean, of course, that yeah.
Stephen Hawking did. He didn't actually use Deck Talk, but it was from the same era and very similar technology, and had a similar sound to it.
And so, like how people really like to customize a lot of the things about their desktop environments and window managers and color schemes. Is there a similar thing for speech synthesis?
Well, the choice of which speech synthesizer you use, especially now that it's all software, is a very personal preference. There are a lot of blind people so you might be surprised to learn that the newer generation, more natural sounding speech synthesizers are not universally chosen by blind people. There are a lot of blind people who still use speech synthesizers from the sort of Deck Talk generation of more robotic sounding synthesizers, because they continue to be very intelligible when you crank up the speech rate. And this is another, I mean, probably one of the most important settings for a blind person to be able to change about their speech synthesizer is how fast it talks, because once you get at all proficient at listening to these things, you'll want to crank it up to at least something moderately faster than its default rate, so you can be more efficient. Now, there's another audio clip that I would like to play if we have about a minute. So this is not so much a demonstration of technology as kind of a glimpse of what you might call blind culture. So in 2000, there was a patch that came out for JAWS that had the unfortunate side effect on some people's machines of blowing away all of their JAWS configuration files and custom scripts. Oh, by the way, JAWS had a scripting language. And so, some people these days, sighted people these days make memes. But there was this one blind teenager back then who, to vent about the effects of this JAWS patch, he loaded up his audio editor and did kind of making fun of the JAWS install, the talking JAWS installer at that time. Let me just play this. Oh, and by the way, the other reason I'm going to play this is because it has a bit of singing Deck Talk at the end.
Oh man!
So is
it Whispering Wendy singing? I don't know if
No.
Yeah,
no. It's the default guy voice singing at the end. But no, I'm not aware of anybody who used Whispering Wendy as their default voice. I think that was just a show-off voice for the creator of the synthesizer. Okay, so this starts out with the opening music and sound effects of the JAWS installer, and then I'll let you know when the satirical part of it begins.
My God.
Sorry, this part's a little long.
Welcome to the JAWS for Windows patch setup program. Please relax.
Okay, this was an actual human voiceover from the original installer.
This may take a couple of minutes. Dr. JAWS, please wait.
Now, this synthesizer that you're hearing, a lot of us still use it.
For JFW, which you have spent years and years customizing for each of your applications. Dr. JAWS has no respect for you.
Yeah, this is.
Deleting all of your JFW settings files. Please wait. Dr. JAWS found errors with JFW. Too bad. Dr. JAWS will not fix them. Dr. JAWS, this program has performed an illegal operation and will be shut down. If the problem persists, contact the program vendor. Close button. Thank you for installing the JFW update patch. Now you're screwed. You are a loser. Ha 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 ha.
Yeah,
that is hilarious, and also I get a dissatisfied user. You got a dissatisfied user. Yeah. That is
That's some level 7 dragging right there. I mean, that is pretty impressive.
that is an actually, Matt, one thing just because you called me out on this week that I really appreciated that one thing that I definitely now appreciate is in terms of putting alt text on on Twitter. Twitter's actually made it super easy to put alt text on things. And I actually you sent me down a whole path of understanding the alt text on images, and it only assists those who need it. It does not in any way. I actually want to find a way for Twitter to give me a reminder that I put alt text on images, because I haven't done that before, and we'll start doing that from now on.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I also noticed when you started live tweeting from the Almost Perfect book the other day.
Oh shit! I didn't do it. You're right.
Well, fortunately, the NVDA screen reader has a built-in command for using the Windows 10 OCR module to do OCR on a graphic, and it was able to do a pretty good job with most of those images. Although there was one, I think it was from the Customer is Always Right versus Customer Always Gripes passage that the picture was not good enough for it to really be able to OCR it well. But yeah, were you taking pictures of an actual book with that? Or?
I was taking pictures of an actual book. I came into this promising myself that I wouldn't talk about the Word Perfect book, but now that you brought it up, yes, I was taking pictures of the book that I was trolling myself with. It's terrible.
Okay.
But no, but it's a good point. It's funny because I had just I almost want a way for Twitter to kind of stop me when tweeting an image, because I need the reminder that to enter. It's easy to enter the alt text, and I need to go do it. It's that the UI is not that easy.
Transcribing those whole passages from the book would be more onerous, I guess.
Onerous only for the contents of the passages, not for the actual.
Yeah.
That would have been easy to go do. So
yeah.
I just a reminder that I really appreciate it, and appreciate, honestly, this has been so great. Thank you for the show and tell too. That has been absolutely awesome.
Yeah. I had to email someone and ask if they could give me a copy of that Jaws patch audio clip. And then when I got it, I was like, oh, this is too long. I won't be able to play it. But then I decided I would at least ask.
It's great. I'm glad you did. It was, as you say, it was a great. I think it's also insight into how load-bearing the software is. And clearly you've got someone who's pretty upset because it's like, hey, by the way, I really depend on this thing for my life. And it's like, I know it's just a bug to you, but it's like it's a really big. And so I thought it's a good window to the importance of of the software.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, thank you again. Really appreciate it. This has been a lot of fun, very educational. The show notes on this one are going to have a lot of interesting links, so looking forward to putting that one together.
Yep. I can also send you, if you like, the audio files that I played, so you can have clean versions of them.
That would be great. I think we'll link to them, right, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be perfect.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, thank you, Matt, especially, and thank you, everyone. This is a lot of fun, very educational, and again, looking forward to getting the notes out there.
Yeah, it was fun for me to go back down memory lane like that. So
awesome. All right, take care, everybody. See you next week.
All right,
thanks.
Bye.
I played, so you can have clean versions of them.
That would be great. I think we'll link to them, right, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be perfect.
Awesome.
All right.
Well, thank you, Matt, especially, and thank you, everyone. This was a lot of fun, very educational. And again, looking forward to getting the notes out there.
Yeah, it was fun for me to go back down memory lane like that. So
awesome. All right, take care, everybody. See you next week.
All right. So
awesome. All right, take care, everybody. See you next week.
All right.
Thanks
Bye.
Bye.